The year was 1891. In the isolated farming community of Ashford, Kansas, life was quiet, predictable, and steeped in superstition. The winters were merciless, the summers dry, and the people endured both with faith and fatigue. Death was no stranger to the town. It came in the form of fever, famine, and the endless cycle of childbirth and loss. But nothing had ever unsettled Ashford quite like the photograph of baby Clara Harlow. The story began in a weathered farmhouse surrounded by miles of barren field. The Harlows were a simple couple: Thomas, a wheat farmer with hands like stone, and Margaret, a woman whose tired eyes spoke of years far heavier than her age. When their infant daughter died suddenly of an unnamed illness, Margaret's grief became unbearable. As was the custom of the time, the family decided to have a post-mortem photograph taken, one last chance to immortalize the child before she was laid to rest. The photographer, Eli Turner, a traveling portraitist known for his patience and discretion, arrived one gray afternoon, his wagon creaking under the weight of his camera and chemicals. He'd taken dozens of these portraits before, each one equally somber, equally silent. But when Eli entered the Harlow home, something felt different. The air was cold though the fire burned hot, and as he set up his tripod in the parlor, he thought he saw the lace curtain behind the cradle flutter, though no window was open. Margaret sat in a stiff wooden chair, her arms cradling little Clara's tiny body. The baby was wrapped in her christening gown, a faded ribbon tied neatly around one wrist. Thomas stood behind them, hands resting on his wife's shoulders, his jaw locked tight. The silence of the house was crushing. Eli murmured instructions: "Hold very still, just a moment more." The long exposure required complete stillness, and in that tense quiet, the ticking of the mantel clock sounded like thunder. When the shutter finally clicked, everyone exhaled at once. Eli packed his equipment, offering his condolences, and promised to return with the finished print within the week. It should have ended there. But days later, as the photograph began to take shape in the dim red glow of his darkroom lantern, Eli froze. The image was crystal clear, the grieving parents, the still child. But Clara's eyes, they were open. Not half-lidded in death, not a reflection or a blur of motion. They were open wide, dark and aware, gazing directly into the camera lens with a clarity no accident could explain. Eli dropped his tongs, the image slipping into the chemical tray. The faint scent of silver nitrate filled the room as he stared, unable to look away. The longer he looked, the more he swore the baby's pupils widened, as if adjusting to the light, as if seeing him. By the next morning, Eli Turner was a man divided between reason and dread. He'd developed hundreds of plates in his life: cracked glass, smudged negatives, ghostly reflections caused by the faintest tremor of a hand. But this was different. The eyes were too sharp, too alive. There was no blur, no distortion. They looked as though the baby had awakened in that exact moment the light struck the plate. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps Margaret had moved. Perhaps a trick of shadow had formed the illusion of open eyes. Yet, when he held the photo up to the lantern once more, he could see it clearly. The glassy stare, pupils dilated as if catching the photographer himself. His hands trembled, and the photo slipped from his grasp, landing face up on the cold floor. For an instant, he thought he saw the tiniest flicker in the eyes, a glint that wasn't there before. He locked the photo in a wooden box, swearing he'd never show it to anyone. But word of such oddities spread fast in towns like Ashford. A neighbor saw Eli's wagon outside the Harlow home that week and asked questions. "A post-mortem of the Harlow baby," he said, and by sunset, every whispering tongue in town was painting a different story. Some said the child's soul had never left her body. Others claimed Margaret had begged someone, to bring her back. When Eli finally returned to the farmhouse to deliver the photo, his heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped animal. Margaret met him at the door, her face pale and sleepless. Thomas stood in the corner, silent. "Did it turn out?" she asked softly. Eli hesitated, then handed her a duplicate he'd made, leaving the original hidden back home. Margaret's trembling hands held the image up to the dim afternoon light. "She looks different," she whispered. The faintest smile spread across her face, not of joy, but of disbelief. "Her eyes are open." Thomas stepped forward, his brow furrowed, staring down at the photograph. His lips parted, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then, a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, came from the cradle in the next room. A creak of wood, the faint brush of fabric, as if something small had moved. Margaret froze, her eyes darting toward the doorway. "It's the wind," Thomas muttered, his voice hollow. But that night, after the lamps were blown out and the silence fell heavy over the farmhouse, Margaret swore she heard breathing beside her bed, shallow, rhythmic, just like Clara's had been before she died. And when she lit a match, she found the photograph resting on the floorboards, face down, though she'd left it on the mantel. In the weeks that followed, the photograph became both a comfort and a curse inside the Harlow home. Margaret began keeping it near her bedside, whispering to it in the long hours before dawn. Neighbors noticed she rarely left the house anymore. Her once bustling garden lay overgrown, and Thomas, usually a man of routine, started missing church services. When Eli Turner passed by one morning to deliver more supplies, he caught a glimpse of the parlor through the cracked curtain. Margaret sitting in her rocker, the photograph clutched to her chest, rocking slowly back and forth. But it was her expression that chilled him. She wasn't weeping or praying. She was smiling faintly, eyes locked on the image as though it were breathing. By then, the whispers around Ashford had turned into something darker. Some claimed that when the lamps flickered in their homes, they saw a child's shadow move along the walls, crawling, searching. The preacher called it grief's delusion. Yet one evening, after visiting the Harlows, even he refused to speak of what he'd seen. He simply said, "The eyes are open in every copy," and left before dusk. It wasn't long before Eli decided to destroy the remaining plates. He couldn't bear the idea of that baby's stare, trapped in glass forever. One night, under a waning moon, he carried the negatives into his barn and set a lantern beside them. As the fire took hold, the smell of burning emulsion filled the air, sharp and acrid. But as he leaned closer, something impossible happened. Through the crackling amber light, he saw the faint outline of a child's face form in the smoke. The same wide eyes, the same hollow innocence. He stumbled backward, dropping the lantern. The flames spread fast, devouring the wooden walls and his photographic equipment. By morning, only ash and a warped lens remained. But when Eli walked into his home hours later, the photograph, the original he had locked away, was sitting neatly on his kitchen table. The edges were unburned, and the child's eyes, once open, now seemed to be looking somewhere else, slightly off to the side, as if aware of something standing just beyond the frame. Something waiting. Word of the fire spread quickly through Ashford, but no one knew its cause. When questioned, Eli Turner said little, only that he'd lost his photographs and that it was for the best. Yet as the smoke cleared from his property, strange things began to happen around town. The blacksmith's youngest daughter swore she saw a small figure standing by the Harlow fence at twilight, too short to be an adult, too still to be a living child. Margaret, meanwhile, claimed she could hear soft tapping from inside the wooden frame of the photograph at night. Sometimes it was rhythmic, like tiny fingers drumming. Other times, it came as faint scratches, as though something inside the picture was trying to get out. Thomas begged her to destroy it, but each time he tried to take it away, the baby's face seemed to change, the expression twisting ever so slightly, the pupils dilating. He couldn't bring himself to burn it. The night he finally decided to bury it behind the house, the soil trembled as he dug. By morning, the photo was back on the mantel, pristine and untouched by dirt. Soon, others began to notice the photograph's effect. The few townsfolk who had glimpsed it, even for a moment, reported the same dream. A child sitting upright in a small wooden crib, staring through the bars, whispering something they could never quite understand. The dreams always ended the same way. The sound of breaking glass and the sensation of falling backward into darkness. Ashford's doctor dismissed it as shared hysteria, a product of gossip and isolation. But when he paid the Harlows a visit, Hoping to calm their fears, he returned home pale and trembling. That night, his wife woke to find him sitting at the edge of their bed, muttering. The eyes moved again. The next morning, he was gone. His boots were found by the creek, his medical bag lying open beside them, the Harlow photograph tucked neatly inside. No footprints led away. Only a faint trail of tiny handprints in the mud, leading toward the water and disappearing beneath the surface. After the doctor's disappearance, Ashford grew silent. No one mentioned the Harlows openly anymore, but their names hung in every whispered conversation. The church bell rang on Sundays, yet fewer people came. Children were warned not to wander near the Harlow house. Some said you could hear crying from the nursery window, even though no one had lived there for months. The curtains, yellowed and torn, fluttered as if moved by small, unseen hands. Eli Turner, the photographer, had vanished as well. His studio stood abandoned at the edge of town, the door padlocked but the windows coated in a fine layer of soot, as though smoke still lived inside. When a group of boys dared each other to look through the keyhole, one came running home in tears. He claimed he'd seen the same baby from the Harlow portrait sitting on Eli's workbench, eyes open, lips moving as if whispering. The boy swore it was trying to tell him its name, but he couldn't make out the words. The next day, that same boy fell ill. He wouldn't eat or speak. When the town doctor, a new one, examined him, he said the child's pupils didn't respond to light. They were frozen wide, like he was trapped staring at something that wasn't really there. Margaret Harlow began keeping a journal then, her handwriting uneven, trembling between lines. She wrote about the smell of smoke that lingered long after the fire, about finding small, soot-covered footprints on her kitchen floor in the morning. They stop at the table, she wrote, as if waiting to be lifted. One night, she heard a soft knock at the nursery door. She knew no one else was home. Her husband had taken to sleeping in the barn, claiming he felt watched inside the house. When Margaret opened the door, the room was empty, but the photograph had changed again. This time, the baby's eyes were no longer looking at the camera. They were turned directly toward her. The next morning, she packed a small bag and went to the sheriff. He listened, stone-faced, until she produced the photo. The moment he looked at it, his lantern flickered out. He dropped it, and the glass shattered across the wooden floor. When the light returned, Margaret swore she saw the faint reflection of the child, not in the photo, but in the shards. Watching, waiting. Before the fire, before the tragedy, Eli Turner had been something of a marvel in rural Kansas. He wasn't born there. No one quite knew where he came from. Some said Chicago, others whispered he'd come from the East Coast, where photography was already a dying art. What everyone agreed on was that his camera captured too much. In his portraits, faces appeared unervingly vivid, as if frozen mid-breath. The eyes, especially, seemed alive. People joked that his photos felt too real, but behind the smiles was unease. Rumor had it that Eli never took a photograph in daylight. He preferred candlelight, insisting it revealed what the human eye could not. He claimed shadows carried emotion, that the lens could trap the final flicker of a soul. When he was hired to photograph the Harlow baby, it was said he refused payment until the job was done. He asked the family not to move the child, not to speak during the process, not even to blink while the shutter opened. If the silence breaks, he said, the spirit will not rest. The Harlows thought it was just his superstition, old photographic nonsense. But when the image developed, even Eli looked unsettled. He had seen something he did not expect, something that should not have appeared behind the glass plate. After that session, Eli became reclusive. He stopped taking commissions and covered his studio windows with thick black curtains. Locals who passed by swore they could hear him talking inside, but only in whispers, like he was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Sometimes the lantern light would flicker through the cracks, pulsing in rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. A delivery boy once claimed he'd been invited in. He said the walls were covered in hundreds of photographs, all of babies. Some had their eyes open, some closed, but each seemed to move slightly when you weren't looking directly at them. He said the air was heavy, thick like smoke, and that Eli's camera was still clicking, even though no one was behind it. When asked where he got his glass plates, Eli said they were gifts from those who don't need reflections anymore. Days later, he was found outside town, half-conscious, muttering about how the last photograph had refused to sleep. His camera lay beside him, shattered. Inside the lens was something sticky, not quite blood, not quite ink. The old Turner studio sat at the edge of the wheat fields, half swallowed by tall grass and silence. Margaret hadn't planned to go there, not really. But after Eli's collapse and the whispers around town, she couldn't shake the thought that he had done something unnatural. She'd seen her baby's photo, the one where her child's eyes seemed to follow her, and she needed answers. The studio door creaked open on its own, groaning like a sigh that had waited too long to be heard. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of silver nitrate, and something else, something sweet, metallic, and old. On the walls hung dozens of portraits. Each was draped with a thin sheet of gauze, but Margaret could still make out faint outlines of faces underneath. Pale ovals, motionless mouths, eyes blurred as if they were caught mid-blink. Her fingers trembled as she brushed away one cloth. The photograph beneath showed a family she didn't recognize, but the child in the woman's arms looked just like hers. The same curls, the same slight dimple near the lip. It wasn't possible. The date scrawled beneath the frame read 1884. Her baby had been born 3 years later. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a stack of glass plates. Some were blank, others faintly etched with ghost-like silhouettes, almost like reflections caught between worlds. Then she saw it, the last undeveloped plate, still sealed inside Eli's wooden camera. The black cloth hung loosely over it, as though he had meant to finish but couldn't. Her hands shook as she pulled it free, holding it up toward the dim light leaking through a crack in the ceiling. For a moment, she thought she saw nothing. Then, slowly, the faint shape of a room began to appear, her own parlor. The details were exact, the wallpaper, the furniture, even the toy box near the window. But in the center, where the coffin had rested during the child's wake, stood someone else. A woman in a dark dress, her head tilted, her face blurred, but the outline unmistakable. It was Margaret. Yet she didn't remember ever standing there like that. Her breath caught. She pressed the plate closer. Behind her blurred figure, at the base of the image, something gleamed faintly, a pair of open eyes. Tiny, wide, and unmistakably aware. It was her child's gaze, staring upward, not lifeless, but looking directly into the lens, as though caught mid-movement. The longer she stared, the more certain she became that those eyes weren't still. Margaret wrapped the glass plate in a length of linen and carried it home beneath her shawl, never once looking behind her. The Kansas sky above was a dull gray, and the fields whispered with dry wind. When she reached her house, the silence was different, deeper somehow, like the air itself had thickened. She set the plate on her kitchen table, the faint sheen of its surface catching what little light came through the window. For hours she sat staring at it, afraid to touch, yet unable to look away. It was just an image, she told herself. A mistake of exposure. Nothing more. But as the evening sun began to sink, the glass grew darker, almost pulsing faintly, as though something inside it stirred. When she finally lit the lamp, the faint reflection of her own face appeared on the surface, except her eyes didn't move when she did. They stayed fixed on the same point in the glass, unblinking, wide. A chill crept up her neck. Margaret reached for the lamp to turn it away, but before she could, a faint scratching sound came from within the wooden table. It wasn't the creak of old wood or the scamper of a mouse. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. The sound followed no pattern, but each tap grew louder, closer, until it seemed to echo beneath her ribs. Then, in the glow of the oil lamp, something shifted on the plate. The faint outline of her parlor, once dim and frozen, began to brighten. The furniture sharpened, the coffin became clearer, and the shadowed figure she'd mistaken for herself now seemed to breathe. Margaret's reflection no longer matched her movements. The woman in the glass tilted her head slowly, almost curiously. Her lips moved, forming words Margaret couldn't hear. The air in the room grew colder, enough that the flame of the lamp quivered. She pressed her hand to the table, steadying herself, but the wood felt damp, slick with condensation that hadn't been there before. And then, faintly, from deep within the glass, came the sound of a baby's breath, wet, fragile, real. Margaret staggered back. The lamp flickered violently, throwing her shadow across the wall. She tried to look away, but her eyes locked on the glass. The child's tiny hand, the one she had seen still in death, now moved. It curled upward, fingers pressing against the barrier of the photograph, as if reaching out toward her. The breath hitched in her throat. It wasn't possible. But the glass shook, just once, enough to send the lamp flame guttering low. And in that wavering light, she swore she saw the baby blink. Margaret's first instinct was simple: destroy it. Whatever curse had attached itself to that photograph had no place in her home. She lifted the plate, trembling, and carried it to the hearth. The fire had burned low, a few embers still glowing faintly red. As she reached forward to throw it in, the glass surface caught the light, and she froze. The baby's face was different now. The eyes were open wider, clear and human, reflecting the firelight as though aware of what she was about to do. For a moment, she saw something else, a movement behind the child, something darker, a shape she could not name. Her arms weakened. She let the plate slip from her fingers. It struck the edge of the iron grate, but instead of shattering, it landed intact, face up. And then came the sound, not from the plate, but from behind her. A faint coo, soft and pitiful, like the sound a newborn makes when waking. Margaret spun, heart pounding, but the house was empty. The sound came again, this time closer, rising just over her shoulder. The smell of burnt oil filled the air, and the shadows around the walls began to stretch longer, darker, moving though nothing else in the room stirred. She backed toward the doorway, whispering a prayer under her breath. But when she looked back at the plate again, she found her reflection staring up at her, and it was smiling. Panic clawed at her chest. She grabbed a dish towel, wrapped it around the plate, and ran outside into the yard. The night had fallen completely now, and the Kansas plains stretched empty and endless. The wind bit through her shawl as she stumbled toward the well behind the house. She dropped the plate into the darkness, waiting for the sound of it breaking on the stones below. But there was none, only silence, deep and wrong, as if the well itself was holding its breath. She leaned over, trying to listen, and caught a faint glimmer far beneath. Then, impossibly, a ripple of light shone back at her, like a lantern swinging underwater. A voice, faint, distant, yet unmistakable, whispered her name from the depths. She ran back inside, bolting the door behind her. But when she turned toward the kitchen table, her breath caught in her throat. There, resting exactly where she had left it before, was the glass plate, clean, dry, untouched by dirt or water. The baby's eyes were wide open now, staring directly at her. And though the photograph had no sound, she could feel it, a heartbeat, slow and rhythmic, pulsing from inside the frame like something alive, waiting for her to come closer. By dawn, Margaret had reached her breaking point. She wrapped the photograph in a burlap cloth and carried it to St. Bridget's Chapel, the small white church at the edge of town. Father Alcott, an old, kind man with silver hair and tired eyes, was sweeping the front steps when she arrived. The moment he saw her face, pale, hollow, trembling, he dropped his broom. Without a word, she unwrapped the cloth. The priest leaned in to look, but the instant his eyes met the photograph, he stepped back sharply, crossing himself. "Who took this?" he whispered. Margaret's voice quivered. "I did." He took the plate gingerly, holding it toward the morning light. For a moment, all seemed still. Then, faintly, the surface shimmered. The child's image flickered as though submerged in rippling water. "You must leave this here," Father Alcott said gravely. "And you must not return tonight." He carried the photograph inside the chapel, lighting candles around the altar. But as he began to pray over it, the air grew colder. The candle flames tilted sideways, bending toward the photograph as if drawn to it. The faint sound of a baby's laughter echoed off the walls, high and hollow, coming from no place in particular. By evening, word had spread through the town. A few curious locals gathered near the chapel, whispering about the photo that breathed. Some claimed they saw light flickering through the stained glass long after sunset. Others swore they heard crying from inside the church, not mournful, but playful, like a baby cooing in the dark. When Father Alcott emerged near midnight, his face was ashen. He told them to return home, his voice shaking, and locked the chapel doors. Inside, alone again, he turned to the altar. The photograph was no longer where he'd left it. It sat now on the pew beside him, face up. The baby's expression had changed, its mouth opened slightly, eyes now focused upward toward the wooden cross hanging above. The priest reached for it with trembling hands. The moment his fingers brushed the glass, the candles all went out at once. In the suffocating blackness, one sound rose clear and close. A baby's whisper, saying, "Father." Father Alcott did not sleep that night. He sat in the chapel pew, the photograph laid before him on the altar like an offering to something that wasn't God. He opened his worn Bible, pages trembling under candlelight. "Deliver us from evil," he murmured, voice unsteady. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and the bell above the church tower groaned softly, though no rope was pulled. He sprinkled holy water across the photograph, but instead of soaking the surface, the droplets rolled across as if rejected, forming tiny mirrored beads. And in each droplet, reflected within the glint of candlelight, the baby's eyes blinked. Alcott gasped, nearly dropping the Bible. He slammed it shut and began reciting prayers faster, louder, but the air in the chapel grew heavy, almost liquid. Each word he spoke seemed swallowed before it reached the rafters. Behind him, the old wooden pews creaked. Something moved in the dark aisle, soft, rhythmic steps like a child crawling on the floor. When Father Alcott turned, the chapel was empty, yet the crawling sound persisted. His eyes darted toward the photograph again. The baby's face was closer now, no longer lying peacefully, its tiny hands pressed against the inside of the glass. The priest's candle sputtered, its flame thinning into a weak blue line. "In nomine Patris," he whispered, but his voice faltered as the child's head slowly turned within the image. He could hear the faint scrape of its gaze following him, its tiny lips moving in rhythm to his prayers. And then came a voice, soft, breathless, impossibly near. "Don't leave me again." The priest stumbled back, knocking over a pew. The photograph slipped from the altar and struck the floor, but instead of shattering, it rang like a bell. The walls quaked, the crucifix above the altar trembled, and every candle burst into light again, forming the shape of a small cradle in flickering flame. Inside it, faint and spectral, lay the shadow of the child, breathing. The next morning, the chapel doors stood open, the air inside thick with the smell of melted wax and rain. A few townsfolk, uneasy but curious, stepped inside. The floorboards moaned beneath their boots. Every candle had burned to the wick, yet the air glowed faintly gold, as though light itself lingered out of reverence or fear. At the altar, Father Alcott's Bible lay open to a blank page, its ink smeared away, as if erased by invisible hands. But what drew everyone's eyes wasn't the Bible, nor the overturned pews. It was the photograph. The glass had cracked cleanly across the center, forming a thin, precise line, a divide between two worlds. On the left, the baby lay peaceful, almost angelic. On the right, the eyes were open, wide, focused. And though the room was still, a faint sound seemed to echo from the walls, a soft rattle, like a cradle being gently rocked in a far corner of the church. "Where's Father Alcott?" A woman whispered, clutching her rosary. No one answered. His coat still hung on the rack. His shoes sat neatly by the pew. But the man himself, and his voice, were gone. When the sheriff arrived, he took one look at the scene and felt his stomach turn. He had seen death before, too often in these forgotten plains, but not like this. The floor beneath the altar bore faint, blackened marks, like tiny footprints. Not a man's, not a woman's. Small, uneven, as if left by a crawling infant. "It's soot from the candles," he muttered, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He ordered the photograph sealed in the evidence box and locked away in the back of his office. But later that night, the deputies heard noises coming from within. Scratching, tapping, like something trying to claw its way out through the wood. One man claimed he heard crying. Another swore he saw the box tremble on its own. By dawn, the sheriff's office was empty. Every drawer open, the photograph gone. In its place was Father Alcott's Bible, its pages filled once more. But this time, in place of scripture, was a single repeated sentence, scrawled hundreds of times over. She's still waiting to be held. By the spring of 1932, the photo had become nothing more than a local ghost story, one that grandmothers whispered to keep children from wandering into the woods after dark. But legends, like curses, never stay buried. That year, the Holloway family moved into an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of rural Kansas, the same house where Father Alcott had once lived before vanishing. The place was quiet, its windows clouded with years of dust, the barn doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. Inside, beneath a loose floorboard in the nursery, they found an old wooden box. Inside it was the photograph, perfectly preserved despite the decades. The baby's face looked soft, innocent. Too innocent. Mrs. Holloway thought it might be a keepsake, perhaps left behind by the previous owners, and placed it gently on the mantel. But that night, when the firelight flickered across the room, her husband swore he saw the baby blink. He told himself it was the shadows, that the mind invents faces and movement when tired. Yet the thought clung to him like the smell of rain in old wood. The air in the nursery grew colder by the hour, and every time their own infant cried, the sound seemed to echo twice, once from the cradle and once from the photograph. A week later, Mrs. Holloway began waking to the sound of humming. A lullaby, soft, measured, coming from the nursery even when the baby slept beside her in bed. Each time she entered the room, the melody stopped, replaced by silence so deep it hurt her ears. One morning, she found faint fingerprints on the inside of the window pane, small, perfect ovals, pressed into the fog as though made by a child looking out. She scrubbed them away, but by dusk, they returned. That night, her husband woke to find her standing before the mantel, the photograph clutched to her chest, whispering, "She's cold, she's cold." The next morning, she didn't remember a thing. Neighbors began hearing noises from the Holloway house. Not screaming, but something quieter. Rocking, humming. Then one day, the house was found empty, the doors swinging open, the fire still burning low. On the table sat the photograph, cracked once again. But this time, the baby's eyes weren't the only ones open. In 1968, almost 80 years after the photo was first taken, a historian named Eleanor Price stumbled upon it while cataloging rural archives for the Kansas Historical Society. The photograph was mislabeled, tucked inside a brittle envelope with only the words "Family Unknown, 1887" scrawled on the back. Even under the dim, flickering light of the archive room, Eleanor noticed something unnerving. The child's eyes seemed to catch the light differently than the others. Not flat, not dead, but almost wet. She adjusted her lamp, thinking it a trick of the glass. Yet as she leaned closer, a thin line, like condensation, ran down the inside of the frame, tracing the child's cheek. She touched it, but the surface was dry. Her rational mind fought to explain it. Temperature change, chemical degradation, the usual signs of old photography. But that night, while reviewing her notes at home, she realized something chilling. The photo had changed. The background, which had once been softly faded, now seemed darker, like storm clouds gathering behind the family. The father's posture appeared slightly different, his eyes turned more toward the child. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Eleanor checked the catalog again. There was no record of the Holloway family, nor any photographer by that name in the county during 1887. It was as though the people in the photograph had never existed at all. Eleanor became obsessed. She began tracing old property records, death certificates, anything that could anchor the image in reality. Weeks turned into months. The archivist who worked beside her complained of cold drafts in the record room, though no vents existed there. Late one night, Eleanor decided to compare multiple enlargements of the image, layering them to spot differences. What she found made her blood run still. In each print, the child's eyes shifted just slightly, as though following whoever studied them. The angle of the pupils, the reflection of the light, it wasn't random degradation. It was intentional movement. She tested it under infrared light, then ultraviolet, but the result was the same. In every spectrum, the baby's gaze had changed. Convinced she was losing her mind, Eleanor tried to destroy the photograph. But when she opened the archival box, she found 2 copies instead of 1. Both identical, both showing the same faint smile creeping across the baby's face. The next morning, the box was gone from her desk. The janitor later said he saw her leave the building after midnight, carrying what looked like a frame wrapped in cloth. She was never seen again. The photograph resurfaced in 1983, cataloged under a different name at a small, underfunded museum in rural Missouri, the Hollow Creek Historical Exhibit. No one knew how it got there. It arrived in an unmarked package, along with a few other damaged prints, all wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. The curator, Martin Keene, a retired teacher with a fascination for forgotten Americana, placed the photos in storage, assuming they were donations. When he finally examined them weeks later, only one stood out, the 1887 family portrait. Its frame was cracked, its glass spiderwebbed at the corners, and yet the photograph beneath was pristine. Martin admired the clarity of the image, the way the light seemed to capture every wrinkle in the mother's apron, every fold in the father's sleeve. But as he focused on the baby in the mother's lap, his admiration turned to unease. The eyes were impossibly detailed, small reflections of light that almost mirrored the museum's overhead lamps. He blinked, leaned closer, and for the briefest moment, swore those tiny glassy eyes blinked back. He laughed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. But that night, when he turned off the lights and locked the door, the emergency bulb flickered, and in that fleeting pulse of red glow, he saw 5 faint figures reflected in the display glass. The next morning, the museum's cleaning staff found Martin sitting at his desk, pale and shaking. He refused to talk about what happened, only mumbling that the photo doesn't stay still. Over the following weeks, he began documenting subtle changes. The father's head angled lower, the baby's expression tightening, the background darkening by degrees. The museum's climate-controlled archive should have preserved it perfectly, but the chemical degradation didn't match any known pattern. Visitors started to complain of nausea or dizziness near the display case. One woman fainted, claiming she heard a baby crying softly when she leaned close. A paranormal research group requested access, but Martin denied them, terrified that exposing the image to more eyes might somehow feed it. One stormy evening, the museum's lights cut out during a power surge. When they returned, the photograph's glass was shattered, and Martin was gone. The police found his keys in the lock, his coat still on the hook, and a single child's handprint pressed inside the display case. After the Hollow Creek Museum's closure in 1984, much of its collection was auctioned off to private collectors. The 1887 portrait, listed simply as Unknown Rural Family, Kansas, sold for $22 to a man named Harold Dunn, a local history enthusiast. He displayed it in his antique shop, Dunn's Curiosities, tucked between taxidermy mounts and old miners' lamps. Customers often paused in front of it, drawn by its unsettling clarity. The baby's eyes seemed almost too sharp, as if they'd been touched up in modern ink, yet the photo's authenticity was undeniable. Harold noticed something else over time. The photo gathered dust slower than everything else around it. Even when cobwebs stretched across his shelves, that frame stayed spotless, as though the glass breathed faint warmth. In 1997, Harold's nephew Eddie, fascinated by his uncle's collection, took the photo to his high school computer lab for a digital scan, the first time the cursed image would ever exist in pixels. When he zoomed in, the baby's eyes reflected not the 19th century setting but a faint grid of light, as though aware it was being copied. Eddie laughed, saved the file to a floppy disk, and uploaded it to an early paranormal message board called Ghost Echo. Within days, hundreds of users downloaded it. That same week, the server began to crash repeatedly, and users reported their computers freezing, each time at the exact moment the baby's face appeared on screen. By 1999, the image had become a minor internet legend, the sixth figure of Kansas. People claimed that when they printed it, faint smudges would appear in the background, slowly forming what looked like another child, smaller and hidden behind the others. Others said that the photo's frame appeared cracked even in digital form, as though mimicking the original damage. One user uploaded a video of his printer spontaneously feeding out blank paper after displaying the image. Another posted an audio clip recorded while viewing it, faint static, followed by a slow, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat. Most dismissed it as coincidence or deliberate editing. But something darker grew around the story. Several forum users who obsessed over the picture vanished from the community entirely. Their accounts remained logged in, but they never posted again. Eddie, the teenager who had scanned the photo, later confided to his girlfriend that he saw a small handprint on his monitor every morning, one that wouldn't wipe off. On December 12, 1999, he deleted the file permanently. Yet a year later, copies of the image resurfaced under different names on archived servers, untouched by time, as if they'd never been erased at all. When digital archivist Martha Gleason stumbled upon the image in 2007, it was buried deep inside an online museum repository labeled Unverified Rural Portraits, 19th Century. At first glance, she dismissed it as another example of early post-mortem photography. But the caption caught her attention. The Hollow Creek family, date unknown. Something about that name tugged at her. She remembered visiting Hollow Creek as a child. Her grandmother used to whisper stories about a photo that moved. Driven by curiosity, Martha downloaded the file and ran it through a resolution enhancement program. What emerged chilled her. Within the baby's pupils, faint reflections could be seen, not of the photographer's camera, but what looked like a second pair of eyes, smaller, deeper, watching back. Convinced she'd uncovered a forgotten case of early photographic trickery, she submitted her findings to an academic journal. But the editor never responded. Instead, days later, she received an anonymous email with no subject line. Attached was the same photograph, now subtly altered. The baby's head tilted a few degrees, its mouth slightly parted, though Martha was certain no digital tampering had been done. When she compared both files, she realized the metadata timestamps were identical. No version should have been different. Yet one was. The email sender's address traced to a server in rural Kansas, the same region where the Hollow Creek family once lived. As Martha dug deeper, she found records of an unsolved disappearance in 1888. The Hollow family had been reported missing after neighbors heard screaming from their farmhouse. The sheriff's report mentioned finding a single photograph left behind, face down on the table. Every name matched. Martha's hands trembled as she stared at her screen. She wasn't analyzing a random image. She was holding a piece of evidence. That night, her laptop camera light flickered on by itself. She covered it with tape, blaming software bugs. But the next morning, the tape was gone, and a new file had appeared on her desktop, titled look_back.jpg. When she opened it, she saw her own reflection, faint, grainy. Standing behind her was the same family from 1887, perfectly framed as if posing again. The photo froze her computer for 12 minutes before it shut off entirely. 2 weeks later, co-workers reported Martha missing. Police found her apartment empty, her laptop smashed, and only one thing on her wall, a printed version of the 1887 photo, freshly inked, the baby's eyes faintly glossy, as if wet. By 2012, the Hollow Creek photograph had gained notoriety online through obscure paranormal forums. A user named Spectre Archive claimed to have obtained a copy from law enforcement contacts and uploaded it for analysis. Within hours, the thread exploded with thousands of replies. People swore that when they zoomed in on the child's eyes, their screens flickered or their webcams glitched, showing reflections that weren't their own. Some users reported hearing faint crying through their headphones, even when the sound was muted. Others said the photograph would reappear on their devices days after deleting it. The moderators eventually removed the post after several users claimed to experience nosebleeds and fainting spells while staring at the file for extended periods. That same week, two independent paranormal investigators, Jonas and Elise Carter, drove from Wichita to the ruins of Hollow Creek. The area was overgrown, the remnants of the farmhouse nothing more than charred wood and broken glass. But what caught Elise's attention wasn't the ruin. It was a faint smell of developer fluid, decades old, still lingering in the soil. When Jonas set up an old film camera to capture long exposure shots of the field, the results were immediate. In the first frame, the scene was normal. In the second, a figure had appeared, the faint silhouette of a small child, head tilted, eyes shining unnaturally bright through the static haze of the old lens. When they developed the negatives that night in their motel bathroom, Elise screamed. The child wasn't alone. Behind it stood the entire Hollow Creek family, the same faces from the 1887 portrait, now blurred, stretched, and watching directly into the camera. The baby's pupils were larger, as if adjusting to the light. Jonas insisted it was an exposure error, but Elise couldn't shake the feeling that the figures had posed. Over the next 3 days, the couple documented eerie sounds outside their window, faint scratching, the creak of footsteps, and once, a single knock on their door at exactly 3:07 a.m. When Jonas finally answered, the hallway was empty, except for a printed photo lying on the floor. It was the 1887 family portrait. Only this time, the baby's eyes had rolled upward completely white, and the background behind the family now included two more people, Jonas and Elise, perfectly centered, looking terrified. They fled the motel that morning, abandoning all their equipment. Neither of them ever published the findings. But a year later, a YouTube video appeared under the name The Carter Files, Hollow Creek. It contained only static, and one frame at the end, too fast to notice unless paused, showing the same photograph, now with a faint shadow crawling over it. By 2018, the Hollow Creek photograph resurfaced, this time under the fluorescent lights of the Topeka Museum of American History, labeled innocently as Rural Family, Kansas, 1887. No one there knew its reputation. The curator, Dr. Meredith Lang, had purchased it at an estate auction bundled among dozens of unmarked photographs. When she unwrapped it from its cracked glass frame, she noticed how unnervingly clean the baby's eyes appeared, almost moist, like the gloss hadn't faded despite the century that had passed. The image was mounted in a corner gallery beside other rural 19th century portraits, and within days, staff began to complain of headaches, nausea, and migraines whenever they passed that section. At first, it was dismissed as mildew exposure. But soon, the gallery's CCTV captured something else. Every night around 2 a.m., the camera flickered and the frame tilted slightly downward, as though pulled by an unseen hand. When janitors reviewed footage, they noticed faint blurs in the reflection of the glass, silhouettes of people standing behind the family, only visible for a second before vanishing. Visitors whispered about hearing a baby crying softly, echoing across the hall, though no sound system existed there. The museum received multiple complaints of unease, but attendance only grew. Curiosity was stronger than fear. One evening in October, during a late-night exhibition, a group of students decided to test the rumors. They filmed the photograph with their phones, laughing nervously, zooming in on the child's eyes. Within minutes, their video glitched, frames distorted, their faces freezing mid-laughter while the baby's pupils seemed to shift. When they replayed the clip, the footage showed one extra face among them, standing between the girls, pale and expressionless, a child's face. The museum's security cameras recorded their panic as they fled, dropping the phone in the hallway. The next morning, the phone was retrieved by Dr. Lang, who plugged it into her office computer to review the footage. The file opened to static, then flickered once, showing her own reflection in the museum's glass, holding the photograph. But as she watched, her reflection smiled, even though she hadn't. The screen went black. When security checked on her hours later, Her office was empty. On her desk lay the Hollow Creek photograph, now unframed, and beneath it, a new image. Dr. Lang, standing among the Hollow Creek family, her expression blank, eyes pale as the rest. The exhibit was closed indefinitely the next morning. Months after the museum's closure, the Hollow Creek photograph vanished from official archives. No record of its removal existed. No log entry, no security footage, nothing. But weeks later, strange reports began circulating online. A digital scan of the image appeared briefly on an obscure history forum before being taken down, though not before several users claimed to have downloaded it. Those who did reported bizarre computer malfunctions, webcams turning on by themselves, image viewers freezing, and static bursts revealing faint reflections in the screen, faces not their own. One user described seeing the baby's eyes blink on their monitor. Another swore the family's expressions subtly changed every time the image reopened, as if caught in the act of breathing. The moderators deleted the post and banned the uploader, but the damage was done. The image spread quietly across corners of the web, copied, re-uploaded, renamed. And like the original, it carried its weight. Reports came from Kansas again, small towns, rural homes. People claiming their old family photos looked different when compared to digital versions. Some said their reflection disappeared entirely when viewing them through their phone cameras. Experts dismissed it as coincidence, compression glitches, or human imagination. But locals in Hollow Creek whispered something older had reawakened, that the family had never truly left their home, only found new glass to haunt. Today, the Hollow Creek photograph remains one of the most quietly feared relics in rural American folklore. Historians debate whether it ever existed at all, or whether its story evolved through superstition and whispers, passed down like an inherited curse. But among archivists and collectors, there's an unspoken rule. If you ever come across a sepia-toned family portrait dated 1887, where the child's eyes seem just a little too alive, don't touch it. Don't scan it. And for God's sake, don't look too long. Because every copy, no matter how old or digital, seems to remember you. A subtle flicker when the light hits just right, a faint reflection in the glass that doesn't match your own. Some say the sixth figure, the one no one could ever explain, was never in the photo to begin with, but rather waiting in the glass for whoever chose to look closely enough. And as the old story goes, once you see it, it sees you too.